Alright, welcome to our lesson on prejudice and discrimination. So, this is an extremely important idea, or at least part of the idea related to diversity, because as I mentioned in our very first lesson, one of the problems that arise is that people oftentimes treat people differently because they belong to a different group. And so, I want to clear up, and we'll take just a little look at this again. Use your chapters, use the textbook. There's going to be a lot of information coming up here, but this is kind of a basic introduction. So let me just go ahead and mention again that one of the things that we see is that prejudice and discrimination are not exactly the same thing. So when we look at prejudice, what we're actually looking at is what people think. So prejudice is thoughts, so it's the attitudes that people have about another group of people. So when you see any of these stereotypes that come up, and stereotypes are those sort of statements where all blank are this, fill in the blank, all women are this, all men are this, all whites are this, all blacks are this. Those are that's a stereotype. As soon as you hear someone say, so-and-so group is this, you're getting a stereotype. And a stereotype is a type of prejudice. It is a negative attitude that rejects in some way the entire group. So it puts people into some grouping and says, because you belong to this group, you must be this. The difference between prejudice and discrimination is, if you take a look, discrimination is the behavior. So discrimination is that action that is taken against people. So in our country, of course, we have freedom of speech, so we are free to think what we want. So prejudice is legal, if not, it's certainly not a good thing, but it is legal. You can think whatever you want about a group. It's discrimination that is outlawed, or outlawed in many cases, is because that is a behavior that you take generally based upon some prejudice, but it is sort of an actual action. So for example, people not renting to someone because they are of a certain race, or they're single mothers, or whatever the case is, that would be the discrimination. We see discrimination, of course, in many other areas. The workplace is always a big one. You can see it in schools at times. You can see it certainly when people go to different places, or they're involved in business and those sort of things. That's where we tend to see discrimination. So prejudice and discrimination tend to go hand in hand, not always, and you'll see a little later why that's the case. But prejudice, remember, is thoughts, and discrimination is action. So if you're looking for one simple sentence that distinguishes them, prejudice is thoughts, discrimination is action. So I'm going to skip through a lot of this, so don't worry about it, just because this is just that basic introduction again. When we look at discrimination, what we often see is there's two different types of discrimination that exist. And those two types of discrimination are individual or attitudinal discrimination. That's the first type. And then there's institutional discrimination. Individual discrimination, or attitudinal discrimination, is the one you are most familiar with. So when you think of discrimination, when someone discriminates against an individual because of the group they belong to, so when that landlord doesn't rent to someone, or the person doesn't get a job or doesn't get a promotion because of the group they belong to, that would be individual discrimination. So I kind of think of that as it's that one-on-one discrimination. There's an individual making that decision based upon their preconceived notions. On the other hand, the one that you may not have heard about, and it's a little more complicated, is this notion of institutional discrimination. And institutional discrimination is discrimination that becomes part of the normal way an institution operates. So institutional discrimination becomes built into how an institution actually operates. So for example, there's a couple of good examples here. One that we've seen, and this is not just in one school or two schools, it's tended to be pretty universal across the United States, is that people who belong to minority groups were much less likely to be identified as being gifted or talented in schools across the country. So there was an overrepresentation of whites in general and an underrepresentation of other minority groups. And it became sort of just the way that these institutions operated. Another example that I'll show you here has to do with home loans, and I know this one's a little bit hard to see. Try to zoom out here, but this actually shows you the percentage of sorry about that, shows you the percentage of people who got denied home loans at 9,300 banks throughout the country. And you can't see all the things, but what this is here, this is based on income. So this is the lower income group, this is the medium income group, and this is a higher income group. And what we see is that one is likely to be turned down. If you look across the board here, it doesn't really matter what the income was. African Americans were more likely to be turned down than other groups. Latinos were more likely to be turned down than whites. And these were apple-to-apple comparisons. And what I mean by that is this is comparisons of people making the same amount of money with similar credit histories. And still what we saw is that built into how the institution operated, there was these assumptions that certain groups were not going to be good people to loan money to. And so even though it's not necessarily an individual making a decision, a lot of this has been built into the computer systems. A lot of it had to do historically with neighborhoods being considered off limits for places where they would give loans to, those sort of things. That's what we mean by institutional discrimination, though. It's discrimination that becomes built into the institution. It's much harder to sort of take this discrimination on, because oftentimes people involved in it don't even know they're involved in this type of discrimination. So it's not necessarily intent by one individual, like you see in individual discrimination. Oftentimes it just becomes built into the normal way an institution operates. But the key here, of course, is that this is action. This represents people not getting home loans who probably should have. The same thing when we start looking at the example of kids not getting placed in gifted and talented who should have. So that's that notion of institutional discrimination. And oftentimes people ask me how much discrimination is still out there and how much discrimination still exists. And I do want to show you this example here. This is a study that was done by Deva Pager out of the University of Chicago. And Deva is actually a criminologist that studies crime and how it impacts people, and of course how it impacts society and those sort of things. And so what she did was she actually put together this study where she sent graduate students out who had taken applications, and they took applications to all of these open jobs that they found, in local newspapers, job banks, those sort of things, and they created these fake identities. And what I mean by fake identities is they'd leave real numbers and such, but their names, everything would be pretty much the same. So the names would differ, but things like the amount of education, the amount of experience they had, everything would look very similar, because she wanted them to look the same except for these two variables. And the two things that varied were, some of them on their applications put they had jail time. So white and black men would put down they had jail time, or they had no jail time. And so the types of arrests that they wrote down there, these weren't real arrests, but the types of arrests they wrote down there were always the same. It was a non-violent drug offense. And then she sort of tracked how many people got a call back, and she found something very interesting. She had already known, of course, she just wanted to measure it. She had already known that individuals who had went to jail had a much harder time getting jobs. That wasn't a big surprise, of course, but she wanted to measure the extent to which that was true. But what was maybe even a little more shocking was the amount of discrimination that still existed. So, and this wasn't one place, this wasn't two places, this was hundreds of places spread out throughout Chicago, the Chicago area. And so you notice that the proportion of people getting a call back for that sort of sit-down interview, if they were white men with no jail time, they were the most likely to get called back for an interview. Now, notice they really shouldn't have been any more likely than this group, because on paper these groups looked the same, because she made them look the same when they did the applications. So they should have been about as likely, but they weren't. You can see that black men were much less likely to get a call back for a job interview, even though on paper their experience and their qualifications looked the same. Interestingly, white men who had jail time were actually more likely to get a call back for a job interview or for an interview than black men with no jail time. So this is just a good example, at least in this one area in Chicago, of how the discrimination still exists and how it's still a prevalent thing in society. I would assume from the studies that I've seen all across the country, there's not much difference depending on where you're at, but you can see that there is certainly still a lot of discrimination out there in how people think. And what we oftentimes see is this is related to these very deeply held prejudices that people have, and they oftentimes don't even realize that it's impacting these types of decisions they make. So that's some examples of discrimination. Let me mention here that let's go back to this one and let me show you this one here. Let me show you, this is an average earnings just to show how things play out overall. So you see this is average earnings by gender and race and ethnicity. So this looks at both gender and race, but if you take a look here, you can see that there is big differences on average earnings for people based upon the groups they belong to. So for example, on average, the group that makes the most are white men. Men generally have more power in society. That is, as a group, men have more power. So if you look, you can see that men tend to do better than women belonging to the same group. So for example, white men are here, and we have white women here, significantly lower. Asian American men are here. Asian American women are right next to them, but still significantly lower on earnings. Black men are here. Sorry, I didn't mean to drag that. Black men are here. Black women are here, significantly lower. Native American men, Native American women, Hispanic men and Hispanic women. So you see that there is this trend that men make more money than women, and of course you can see that there's definitely a trend as far as what group people belong to, which groups make more money on average than other groups. A lot of this is related to long-term discrimination and inequalities that existed in society for hundreds of years, so it's hard to change those or get those to go back right away. Okay, so what I did here is somehow lost that for you. There you go. Okay, but I'm going to wrap this up anyways. I just wanted to give you a basic sort of primer, a little bit of basic information on the prejudice and discrimination that exists in society. So one of the things that we see is that prejudice and discrimination are still prevalent, and you'll find more of this examples in your book, and of course you'll find more in the resources that I left. By the way, there's a great video, I can't show it here, but there's a video that I have in the materials folder that shows some 2020 experiments where they go out and try to see how people are treated based upon their race and ethnicity, and you see that there are some pretty significant differences. Not exactly a scientific study, but it's certainly still worthwhile information. So the short of it is, remember, prejudice is thought, discrimination is action, and these are sort of the things that we need to be working on in society. Alright, so once again, y'all have a great week out there. Be sure you get all of your assignments done. Be sure you're following along. It's easy to get behind in this course, and you don't want to do that since everything's due and then it's done. So I hope you all have a great week.